Well, hi, my name's Harrison. I wanted to share with you some of my top selected books that I read this year. I have a cup of tea, and we've got the incense burning. Let's start taking a look at the selections. So, as you can see, I have a big stack of books over here on my desk. I want to start with the thing that is most fresh on my mind, and that is Beowulf. I just finished rereading this actually. Or perhaps I should say finished it, because about a year ago is when I first picked up a copy, this one, and I started it and really enjoyed it. But I think at the time I was still a little bit unprepared to fully engage with the material the way that I needed to. And so while it interested me and while I actually enjoyed the content fairly significantly, I think over time, as other responsibilities and whatnot came on, it just sort of got dropped by the wayside. So this year I picked it up just a few weeks ago actually, and I wanted to go into a deep dive. For some background, I actually teach literature to middle and high schoolers, and at the time I was sort of finishing up my junior year in undergrad, and I was really just sort of developing a bit of a taste for this kind of a real like serious literature. And like I said, I don't think I really had the context to be able to process through it very well. But now, after some more experience, both academically and professionally, I really enjoyed my read of Beowulf this time. Seamus Heaney's introduction as well, his preface to this copy, is excellent. This time I wanted to sit down with the material a little bit more. This is a cliche word to use, but intentionally, I suppose. I need more from it. I wanted to dedicate more of my mind to it, to really thinking about it, not just sort of reading it for the aesthetic, ironically. He talks a lot about his own personal experience as a linguist, as a philologist, and he gives you both sort of a personal background to his translation and an academic or intellectual one. To the story itself, though, absolutely brilliant. I don't want to really... I mean, it's a 1,500-year-old story. I don't think I'm in much danger of spoiling it, but essentially this Norse hero, the typical Norse hero, Beowulf, faces three monsters. And the first two he does in protection of actually a once sort of at odds nation, the Danish people. He goes and fights for them because Grendel, and then later we'll discover that Grendel's mother. There's just lots and lots of death caused by these sort of spirit/demonic painted kind of figures. They're actually, the descriptions are rather vague. We don't get much of a picture of what Grendel and his mother really are. They are called both descendants of Cain, and Heaney's translation offers something like a fatherless species, something like that, which is very interesting. A very interesting thing when you combine the sort of combine that with the poetic language of descendants of Cain. Clearly that's not intended to be literal in the mind of the author. Nonetheless, it is interesting to see these two kinds of ways of looking at these sort of spirit/demon creatures. Beowulf is presented as the typical sort of Norse hero. He is courageous. He's fearless. He's willing to go to battle, actually for the purpose of peace. This is the thing that kind of I struggled with about the book. I couldn't make sense of the two concepts of glory seeking and self-sacrifice. And maybe that's a problem that perhaps the medieval English and Norse didn't really have any trouble with. They didn't see those two concepts as mutually exclusive. But I found Beowulf is clearly humble in this story, or maybe I should say submissive. He's doing so for the protection of the innocent. He's doing so for service to his own king. That's mentioned several times. And he's doing so for the service of the king of the Danes, right, of the Danish people. At the same time, in the same breath even as those sentences, he's mentioned as doing so for his seeking glory, right? Which again, I'm not really looking at that as abnormal, right? That's part of the culture of the sort of the Norse, Anglo, and maybe even Anglo-Saxon in some senses. By the way, if you're not familiar, this is a story in Anglo-Saxon, in Old English, written about Norse people. So it's actually even fairly cross-cultural in some senses there, which I'd like to do some more research on. But nonetheless, I know that wouldn't be anything strange for them, right? This idea of glory seeking. That I don't think nobody would look at that as morally concerning, right? That's actually, it's good. It's the good thing in that framework. But I don't see how that can coexist with the idea of submission or self-sacrifice. In my modern and particularly Christian worldview, those things seem to be at odds. Is perhaps my evangelical upbringing. A lot of the language that gets used around what it means to be self-sacrificing and live in submission, and maybe the concept of glory seeking in the Norse sense isn't quite at odds with this in the way that it feels. I need to save the rest of my thoughts on Beowulf probably for a separate video. I might dive into Beowulf a little bit deeper in a separate video, but nonetheless, Beowulf and Seamus Heaney's translation of it is absolutely one of my best reads this year. Read it a million times again. It's actually very short. The book really should be about half this size because it's interlinear. So you've got the Old English on the left page and the modern translation on the right, which, especially if you're interested in linguistics or philology in any sense, is really, really awesome because you can sort of make the connections and even intuitively sort of parse out some of the grammar, the way the language works. I spent about 4 or 5 hours one day after I finished the book doing like a crash course on like an introduction to the mechanics of Old English. And I found it really, really interesting. So if you're interested in, honestly, just even in history or anthropology, I would definitely check out Beowulf. You cannot really be deep in the canon without getting your hands on Beowulf. It's fantastic. I would give it probably, let's say, aside from some of my qualms and questions about the story that are really more personal, I'd say probably a 9 out of 10. My next fiction pick is The World, the Flesh, and Father Smith by a guy named Bruce Marshall. This book was just absolutely beautiful for me. I found it to be really, really incredible. The thing that turned me on to this book was a couple things. One, there's a quote that's typically attributed to G.K. Chesterton that goes something like, even the man who, knocks on the door of the brothel is actually deep down searching for God. That quote is attributed to G.K. Chesterton just time and time again. And I found out it's not his quote, actually. He may have said something like it, but it comes from this guy. It comes from Bruce Marshall, who was a fairly no-name, unimportant Scottish author, who actually this, I think, appears to be one of his most successful works. And I love that quote. And I love Chesterton. I thought, well, if this, sounds like him and rings like him, surely this guy who, they're sort of gotten mixed up, has something good to say as well. Actually, on a podcast I frequent, the Sacramentalists, Father Wesley Walker, I believe, recommended this book. And it just so happens, I just found it one day. I wasn't even looking for it. I found it at a used bookstore that my wife and I go to quite often. And I thought, this is awesome. I've been like thinking about this book ever since I've heard this, mix up between the quotes. I've been thinking about this. And so I found it then, and it's got a really cool, like little old cover on here. I really like the design. Maybe I can include a picture in there. Then under it, it's literally just like a basic blue book. It's pretty old, but I love old books like this. I love how worn the pages are. I think there's life and character to the book that isn't just serving a mere aesthetic purpose. It shows it shows that it has actually existed. It's about a Catholic priest who is ministering in Presbyterian Scotland towards the beginning of the 20th century. And it literally walks you through his entire life as a Catholic priest. But in some senses, being a Catholic priest in Scotland, which is, entirely and fairly nationalistically Presbyterian, there is actually a real sense of persecution that would go on there. And I need to save my full commentary on this for a separate video. But it's really, really beautiful. For example, it takes him through the story of him serving with his bishop and the priest who, another priest who's also similar, close to that area in Scotland. It walks through these amazing events of history, like cinemas coming to town, and how does the church deal with these things? And in a lot of ways, it felt like very similar to the same ways that we as the church today wrestle through technology, and navigating through, okay, what's our response here? And it's actually it's very uplifting, and it's encouraging. I think, when we talk about fiction, we're inhabiting a world for a time, and for me to inhabit the world of this deeply devout priest in a land that does not want him, and those are the people that he's trying to serve, which is a very Christ-like thing. And more than just like a figurative sense, and literally is what is spoken of Christ in the prophet Isaiah. He was despised, and these and like Paul says, these are the people that he came to save, and he was rejected. And so very similar to that. And you actually see the battle, and actually quite ecumenically, this friendship between Father Smith and the Presbyterian minister. And I think at one point they mention a Baptist minister or maybe Methodist or something like that. But there's actually this sort of quiet camaraderie and some tension in some places, but it's really, really quite nice. Through his time as a chaplain and the war, when that rolls around, and how the war affects the people of this town that he has lived with and been around his entire life, and their relationship to the church. And it's sad, it's beautiful, it's deep, and it's really just, I think most of all, I just smiled. There's lots of wonderful quotes in here. Oh yeah, when I was reading this, it was around the time that I had just gone to a lecture on C.S. Lewis that essentially discussed his sense of being a Luddite. He avoided a lot of the technological development, and not simply for being somebody who wanted to be anti-mainstream or anti-current culture. I mean, that certainly would be ridiculous. But the way he talks about cars, and it actually takes away from the value of space, from existing in space somewhere. And I was just really, really fascinated by his views on this at the time. Still am, but I was right in the middle of that high from this lecture that I attended. And I read this quote here where Father Smith talks with the Reverend Mother of the nearby convent, and she asks him something in French, and he says they're essentially having a conversation about technology and about development, and how a lot of these things feel like it gives us license to stray from God. And he says this: history shows that most human inventions tend to be used for evil rather than for good purposes. If I were Almighty God, ma reverend mère, I should not have allowed James Watt to watch that beastly kettle boil. And I think I should have silenced Marconi and Edison as well. For all these inventions defeat the main purpose of the church, that man should be still and know that he is God. And that was so deeply similar to what I had just heard from Lewis, which is we need to be slow, actually. The call of the Christian in the modern world, we actually need to slow things down quite a bit. And he was writing that in the 1940s. And then later on, he adds, perhaps men don't learn better because God doesn't let them live long enough on earth, Father Smith said. And he's trying to maybe be a bit more positive in his outlook. I see in Father Smith here the tendency towards cynicism. And I felt quite relatable there. That is also mine. And watching him as a clergyman sort of experience these waves of cynicism and find the beauty and the good again and again, it was just deeply encouraging. He says, as soon as they have made a pretense of school, they have to be teaching their sons, and their teeth go long and yellow, and they are dead. It is the same with our civilization. Things move too quickly. Men haven't plowed enough fields to be able to work safely in factories. It's just fantastic. So, really, really excellent. I highly recommend it. So I would give this book easily an 8 or 9 out of 10. Really, really enjoyed it. I highly recommend it. It's great. Okay, next. Now you're going to be surprised at the fact that I've only recently read some of these. I need to let you know, I did not grow up as a reader. I was really not a very interesting child in terms of how I approach literature. I did do music. I did theater. I was very invested in the arts. But I didn't have much of the attention span for reading at the time. I still question if I have enough attention span to do much of anything, but alas, I'm an adult and have to sort of make do. But as a child, no, I would have rather actually played video games. And looking back on it, that's really funny. But all that is a massive apology to say a lot of these things that I should have been exposed to easily by now, I just never took the time to sit down with. I'm looking at Brave New World next by Aldous Huxley. Clearly, this is a classic in terms of dystopian literature, and people are actually quoting Brave New World a lot now, and as opposed to 1984. And it actually, I think it maybe depends on what side of the spectrum politically you may be on, depending on which one of these dystopian books you are reading into our current situation at the moment. A lot of people are quoting 1984, particularly on the liberal side, if their concern is fascism with the election of President Donald Trump again, be concerned about government overreach, which is perhaps a bit ironic in a lot of ways. I see the 1984. I do. I tend to think that we are much more in a Brave New World style of dystopian. The difference between Brave New World and 1984 is an imposed dystopia in one sense, and I think maybe in some ways Brave New World is too, because there is still the sort of the structure and the governmental aspect of it, the system, right? And that's just a kind of typical trope of dystopian literature in that sense. But Brave New World is different because there's actually this sense in which when the main character, and I read this nearly a year ago now, I was back in the very beginning of this year, his name is Bernard Marx. And Marx essentially is, in Huxley's world here, there's a very rigid caste system. So, you have your alphas, betas, gammas, deltas, epsilons, whatnot, and they fulfill a very particular role from birth to society, right? They are trained to do certain things and be certain ways, and you are to look at those people as their role, right? Because that's part of what holds the society together. It's about stability. And in this world, things that might cause fluctuation or disruption in the patterns, such as religion, such as love, such as family, such as actually really anything with depth or meaning, is stripped away. It's gone. Because that could cause an imbalance. It could cause things to break the pattern. And they're replaced with only the things that are instant gratification, right? Temporary pleasure, sex, comfort, drugs, how to experience the most pleasure and comfort now. I do really, really appreciate the perspective of sort of, it's not actually really about government overreach. It's about maybe in the beginning, right? Maybe it starts that way. But over time, even if the government said, okay, we're taking our hands off, the people would choose it anyway, right? The people would choose comfort and pleasure and instant gratification over depth and meaning because it's too uncomfortable. It's too painful. It's too hard to handle at this point. And I think this is what Huxley is seeing around the same time actually that Lewis is writing. He dies in 1963, the same year that Lewis dies, same year that JFK dies, ironically. But I think he sees a lot of these same issues, actually, even though he sees them from a very different worldview. Not a Christian, not religious, really, but he sees the value of religion. He thinks it's necessary. He thinks that actually we need it because it provides depth, it provides meaning. We see a chosen dystopian as opposed to an enforced dystopia. I think it really speaks to our current situation. I would recommend it to everybody. I would say probably a 7 or 8 out of 10. These are all high reads. I'm giving you my favorites. So I would say 7 to 8 out of 10 for Brave New World. All right, time for what is probably my favorite read this year. I have here a collection of the 3 books in Lewis's space series. I read through Out of the Silent Planet for the first time, And it's just absolutely incredible. When you compare it to the Chronicles of Narnia, particularly like something like The Magician's Nephew, it feels markedly different than Lewis's other fiction writing. I think it has, and it's quite early for him, I believe, in his fiction writing career. And so I think in a lot of ways it carries a bit of a darker tone, not in terms of like necessarily content per se, but the feel is, the accent, the tone. It feels a little bit more serious, a bit darker. I love the character of Ransom, which I believe is based on his friend J.R.R. Tolkien, this philologist that goes on break from teaching. And of course, nobody would be out looking for him while he's up in space, because who looks for a professor on their holiday? I think it's really brilliant. There's a lot of like little subtle humorous elements in here. I think that makes it really good. Like Lewis, a lot of new fiction I find tries to make everything funny. It's either that or everything feels like emo. Everything just feels brooding and like a teenager who's just, they're upset about something. And I don't find either one of those things to be appealing, because I don't think you can actually take anything seriously that way. I think when you make something overly serious and make it just, angsty is the word I was looking for. It's cheesy, it's dumb. And then when you try to make everything comical all the time, it feels childish. And this is a really, really wonderful mixture of, there is a kind of darker feel than like a children's story like Chronicles of Narnia. But at the same time, there are little bits of levity and humor, and most of them come at Ransom's expense as a foreigner, which I find to be a actually pretty particularly fun point. It's able to kind of joke around about his experience as somebody who's not familiar with his environment, anything about it, right? And in that way, that's kind of a relatable experience. If you've ever traveled to a foreign country, or honestly ever been to another part of America, if you're an American citizen, there can be this real sense of this is super different. I really, really appreciate the world building here. I think the philological aspects are awesome. The way he fleshes out the language a bit. It's not quite the way that, like Tolkien builds up languages in Lord of the Rings and whatnot, but actually I think that's quite nice. I think it's enough to show that there's care in how Lewis develops the world, but at the same time, he's not necessarily exhausting every single detail. He just wants to show you this is a thing. He wants you to get rooted into it. And I think on some level it has something to do with the fact that his main character is a philologist, right? So it's actually walking you through his perspective as somebody who understands, if I want to know what I need to know about the culture, if I want to know how to survive here on this other planet, I have to first understand the language. That obviously is just connected to the heart of both Lewis and Tolkien. As just brilliant literary scholars. I think that's an excellent point to bring out. But I love this. There's one particular place in the book. The Harassa seems to be confused as to why humans, according to Ransom's experience and relay, why they are so concerned with having pleasure all the time. And actually, maybe that ties a bit back into Brave New World, right? Lewis is also throughout this trilogy exploring the themes and concepts of technological overreach, and in a sense that actually just, it's not like oppressive technology as this external being. It's that it releases these aspects of over comfort, over pleasure, over dependence or reliance on the unnatural to make us more at home, right? To actually derealize things. Very similar themes there. And I imagine it's because they're living through a lot of the same thing. But the Harassa is just incredibly surprised at why human beings would want to have these things of pleasure all the time. And so one of the concepts discussed here is the Harassa essentially saying, why would they're reflecting on human beings want sex all the time. They want this all the time. They want food. There's an overconsumption. There's a materialism. There's all of these things that bring us pleasure all the time. And the Harassa has great confusion over this, because as one of the intelligent life forms on Malacandra, he expresses confusion towards it because they are fundamentally a balanced kind of people. They live in a harmonious way. And one of the ways that Lewis describes them is as a species that is like poetic. They speak in poetry, right? And again, very interestingly, they value language. Shows you where Lewis's priorities are and how he's writing this. But their response to this is, well, why would you want dinner all the time? Because then it wouldn't actually be enjoyable anymore, right? If you have the same pleasure over and over and over and over again, well, at some point it just loses all meaning. It loses any kind of real value. There's a contrast of this human idea of constant gratification with the rasa idea of contentedness, of enjoying things in their due season, letting things, come and go, and just seeing it as a part of the natural rhythms and cycles of life. I think that is one of my favorite parts about this book. I would give Out of the Silent Planet probably, actually maybe a 9 or a 10. I can't just pick one thing. I'm really bad at that, but probably a 9 or a 10. It's been my favorite read this whole year. It was great. It's not incredibly long. It's very deep. It's got humor. It's serious. It's everything that I would look for in a novel. So yeah, I'd say 9 or 10. And last, I really won't spend any time on this, but Charles Dickens, A Christmas Carol. And this is a bit of a cheat one because I'm actually not finished. My wife and I are currently reading through this for the Christmas season, and we're about halfway through. And I grew up every year with my family watching A Muppet Christmas Carol. It was just part of our tradition. And so I had, coming into reading the book now, the actual thing, the material that's based off of, the classic piece of literature, found that I was actually quite at home and comfortable with the book because The Muppet Christmas Carol is actually a fairly faithful rendition. They do add a Marley brother, which is a little interesting. But of course, you have to keep the hecklers from the Muppets together. There's lots of the dialogue from the actual book is almost literally just directly in the movie, especially lots of Scrooge's dialogue. It's incredible. I think I'm more so now reviewing the movie, but it's an incredibly faithful rendering. I've deeply enjoyed the book so far. It's beautiful. The language is incredible. I had a friend of mine, a colleague, explain how Dickens is dense, right? He's difficult. I don't find that to be the case. I think he's quite poetic. I think he's really, really light and wonderful to read. The only things that I find difficult to read about him are the same that I would say about Conan Doyle, and it's those things that are maybe particularly British things or particularly Victorian things, that time and culture that may just not be part of our common vocabulary. But I don't find the language itself to be necessarily just over and above our heads today. And again, that's going to differ depending on your vocabulary and how steep you are in the literary tradition and whatnot. But I think it's quite easy to understand, even if you haven't been exposed to lots of different kinds of literature. So really, really enjoy it. I think the language is beautiful. I did not realize how thoroughly Anglican this text was. It's deeply rooted in the Church of England. I mean, as it really had to be at this time. But that's been a pleasant surprise. So I'm not going to give it a rating because I'm not all the way through. I anticipate I'm going to give it somewhere between an 8 or a 10 because it's really quite great. But yeah, so it's been a nice Christmas read, and I'm looking forward to finishing that out. These are sort of my top fiction books of 2024. Hope you enjoyed. I hope you'll check these out if you haven't read them. I think they're fantastic. They're all really, really enjoyable, and they have taught me a lot. They've built things in me. They have increased certain sensitivities or pleasures, and they have corrected me in areas where I needed to be shown the right. And so I commend you. Check them out. If you have, tell me your thoughts on them. And hopefully I'll be able to do a couple in-depth videos on at least one or two of these. Like I'd particularly like to do an in-depth video on Beowulf or The World of Flesh and Father Smith. But for this overview of sort of my top books of 2024, I hope you enjoyed these top fiction books, and I will maybe see you again.